And so today we're talking about setting curve advisory speeds. How do we do that? And also, how do we help keep the public safer on the roadway? How do we reduce injuries and fatalities? So this is really a great workshop, a great opportunity for you to become a safety champion, to take part in that. So we're going to be talking about really how to keep people on the roadway. I'm going to first build the case for why that's important. Then I'm going to show you what the numbers say as far as keeping people on the roadway. And the goal is to end up with about 10 minutes left. So about 10 minutes left or so for questions that you might have. But also, as we go through the material, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And you can do that by unmuting yourself and asking the question, raising your hand, or even better, just put it in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring the chat box, and I'll be able to see any questions that you guys might have. Also in the chat box, I'm going to put a handout for you. It's going to have some of the information that we're going to cover today. And it comes out of the MUTCD, plus some really handy forms that we've created just for you and just in the webinar. So I'll go ahead and upload that. If you look in the chat box, you'll see the handout for the workshop, and that's something that you can definitely download if you want to and follow along. But we're going to be talking about how we keep people on the road, how we set those advisory speeds, and that's really critical. You know, I want to build the why first. Our why is that in Kentucky, man, we have a lot of individuals that don't make it on our roadways. And there are a lot of factors that the driver is responsible for. Some of them are distracted. Some of them are maybe intoxicated. Maybe they're drunk. Maybe they've been smoking a little bit of weed that morning. But there's also things that we have on our roadways that impact it. There's roadway factors. There are things that we as owners of roadway systems, as cities, counties, the DOT, or as contractors or engineering consultants, there are things that we can do to improve this, to reduce these number of collisions, and along with that, injuries and fatalities. But 732, that's the number Janet gave you earlier. Those were the numbers for 2019, the latest official numbers. For 2020, they were even higher. But as you look at that, that is really 2 per day. And that's the opportunity. That's the field that we're working in. That's the harvest. That is how many individuals that we could potentially help save. And that's, along with that, a tremendous number of injuries that go along with that as well. So over 2 per day, people dying on our roads. By the way, compared to nationwide, we have about 38,000 individuals dying on the roadways each year. Varies a little bit year by year, but for us, 2 per day. And looking at the data is always important because we want to figure out how are they dying. If we're going to fix the problem, if we're going to do the best that we can, then man, we really need to look at the data and figure out what's going on with that. All right, so as we look at the data, this comes from the 2019 collision data from the State Police database. We'll find out that when people die on our roadways, the fatal collisions, 41% is with other moving vehicles and 29% is with fixed objects. And we find out that really roughly over 60% of the fatalities we have in our state are individuals leaving their lane of travel. That's how you have collision with other moving vehicles. That's how you have collisions with fixed objects. And so the goal really is to keep people on the road and in their lane, in between the center line and the edge line, if we have those on the roadway, because that's where they're the safest. And that's where our biggest opportunity lies, is keeping them on the road and preventing lane departure or roadway departure. So we dig a little deeper. We realize that people are leaving the roadway. That's the biggest occurrence when they die on our roadways, is they've left their lane of departure. But where does that occur? What are the characteristics the geometry of the roadway. So as we look at the 2019 crash data from the state police, we'll find out that a lot of this is occurring in curves. As a matter of fact, over 30% of the fatalities in Kentucky are in a curve. And in the US, as Janet said, more than 3 times as many crashes occur on curves as do in straight segments of the roadway. So the goal, man, keep people on the roadway, keep people in their lane of travel, and then we're not going to have head-on collisions. We're not going to have collisions with other moving vehicles, and we're not going to have fixed object crashes like you see in these 2 photos. So how do we keep people on the road and in their lane? Well, there's a series of things that we could look at. And all of these are definitely ways that we could keep people on the roadway. These are things that as transportation agencies, we try to either put in place or maintain. For example, signage of all types has a tremendous crash reduction factor. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but also the way the water is draining off the road, the super elevation in the curves, the sight lines, etc. All of that is critical. But in my opinion, signage is one of your best opportunities. Now, why do I say that? It's because signage has a tremendous benefit cost ratio. In other words, this particular installation here is just a turn sign, advisory speed underneath it. That is, $150 or $200. But with that simple expenditure of funds, you can realize up to 22% crash reduction factor. Now, when I say CRF or crash reduction factor, that just means a reduction in crashes or collisions. And the way that things have changed over the years, at one point we were calling them accidents, then they went to crashes, and now they're collisions. But as a 22% crash reduction factor for this $150 expenditure, to put that into perspective, that means that if on this particular curve, over the last 5 years, I had 10 crashes, then after I installed this sign assembly, then over the next 5 years, I could expect 7.8 crashes, or roughly 8 crashes. I would see a 22% reduction in crashes. And that number gets even better for certain types of crashes when we look at the one direction large arrow or the chevron. Sometimes it goes up to almost 50% reduction. So definitely signage is a benefit for the public, and has a tremendous benefit to cost ratio in keeping people on the roadway. And as we look at the MUTCD, Janet mentioned that earlier, the manual and uniform traffic control devices, we have a lot of options for signing a curve. These are some of those: the turn sign, the curve sign, reverse turn, reverse curve, and the winding road. And those are going to be used in different applications based upon the speed of the curve coming up. So in other words, for 30 miles per hour or less advisory speed, the MUTCD says it shall be this turn sign. For an advisory speed of 35 or above, it shall be the curve sign. The reverse turn, the MUTCD says that if you have a 2 changes in horizontal alignment, so that's a curve, in opposite directions that are separated by less than 600 feet on the tangent or the straight distance from the end of one curve to the beginning of the next, you should use this reverse turn. And again, that's going to be for 30 miles per hour or less advisory speed. For the reverse curve, again, 2 changes in the roadway, horizontal alignment in opposite directions, separated by less than 600 feet on the tangent or the distance from the end of one curve to the beginning of the next, then we should use this reverse curve. And that would be for an advisory speed of 35 miles per hour or more. Then we have the winding road sign, which is an option when you have 3 or more curves that are each separated again by less than 600 feet on the straight or tangent, or it can be used with a plaque underneath it that says next so many miles. But whichever one of these we choose or were required or recommended by the MUTCD to utilize, underneath it, we're either going to be required or recommended to have an advisory speed plaque. And that's really the focus of the workshop today is how do we figure out what that advisory speed is? In addition to that, as you read in the MUTCD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, you're going to figure out that in advance of that curve or change in the roadway coming up, we need to put that turn or curve or reverse turn or reverse curve sign with the advisory speed plaque. And it needs to be a certain distance in front of the beginning of that curve so the public can see it and realize that, wait a minute, I got to slow down from 55 to 25 miles an hour. Well, that minimum advanced placement distance, in order to read that chart, you have to know the advisory speed. In order to know the level of signage that we need. In other words, on the outside of the curve, we could put chevrons. Right? Those are those black arrows on a yellow background that lead people around the curve, or the one direction large arrow. They may be required, recommended, or optional. And to determine that, the chart that we look at, table 2C-5, requires that we know the advisory speed. And if you choose to use chevrons on the outside of the curve, then the spacing of those is again determined by the advisory speed. So this advisory speed is really important and critical, not only for making sure that we have the right level of signage on the curve so that we can then properly reduce roadway departure and again, reduce injuries and fatalities. Not only is it important for that, but it's also important for, again, each one of these charts so we know where to place the signage. Now, all of those charts that I showed you, they come out of the MUTCD. That's the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. If you're not familiar with that acronym, hopefully you are. But if you don't have a copy of this book, then I encourage you to get it. Here's a website where you could go to get it. It's the mutcd.fhwa.dot.gov. And you're going to be looking for the 2009 MUTCD. It had 2 revisions. The second revision was in 2011. So make sure that it has both revisions in there. And it gives us the criteria for figuring out advisory speeds. And that's what we're going to go over today. So I would also encourage you to print out or to open up the handout that I posted in the chat box. It has a few excerpts from the MUTCD, and I'll be giving those to you or going over those. Another reason that knowing how to determine the advisory speed is important is that you'll need it to comply with the compliance date for horizontal alignment signage. Now, what do I mean by that? In the MUTCD, we have a lot of things that are shalls, shoulds, and we have some mays as well. If something is listed in there as a shall or a should, that's something you absolutely have to do. If it's a shall or a should, you should do it unless there's a very good reason not to. And that reason needs to be on the order of magnitude of an engineering study or engineering judgment. But when the 2009 MUTCD came out, some things changed over the 2003 MUTCD. For example, if I have a 4-way stop, so I got a crossroad where each leg stops, underneath the stop sign, in the past, I would put a 4-way plaque if all 4 legs stopped. Well, what does that plaque say now? In the chat box, type that in. So this is this is an active webinar as well. So type in, what would I place underneath the stop sign if all the legs of the intersection stopped? Yeah, Jared is the first one in. Brett is too, Kevin. Yeah, it says all way now. So that changed in the 2009 MUTCD, but if you were a city and that came out and that changed, did you have to go out and change all of your signs at once? And the answer is no. The answer is for most everything in the MUTCD, 95% of it, you only change it through routine maintenance, new construction, or rebuilds or retrofits of existing assemblies. That's when you update. If I'm going to go out there and touch that sign and change it out, then I've got to use the new standard. That's important to remember because the MUTCD has a new version that's coming out any day now. We're not sure when it is, but it's going to be soon, is what we're told by the Federal Highway Administration. But then there's a few things that we find in the MUTCD that are so important from a safety standpoint that they placed a compliance date on it. And they said, by this date, everything out in the field shall meet the new standard. And the section that we're going to talk about with setting curve advisory speeds and curve signage has a compliance date. And that compliance date was roughly 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, December 31st, 2019. And that applies to, in your handout, check out page 2. So on page 2 of your handout, at the top of the page, this is also page 110 of the MUTCD, you'll see paragraph 2. And paragraph 2 says, in advance of horizontal curves on freeways or expressways and on roadways with more than 1,000 average annual daily traffic that are functionally classified as arterials or collectors, horizontal alignment warning signs shall be used in accordance with table 2C-5, which is at the bottom of page 2, page 110 of the MUTCD. This is the section that has the compliance date. So that means that as a city government, county government, as you're looking at this, if you have any roads that could be arterials or collectors, then you are required to run those and that have over 1,000 average annual daily traffic. You are required to run those prior to December 31st, 2019, determine what level of curve signage is needed, if any, for the changes in the roadway coming up, and then install that signage. And some of you may be behind schedule. By the way, functional classification, if you're not familiar with that, an arterial is a main artery that goes from one major city to another. So as cities or counties listening, you may not have those, but you probably do have a lot of collectors. Collectors take all the traffic from the main arteries and they funnel that to the local roads. And so this section is something that, by 2019, we were supposed to have done for all of our roadways. And just as a side note, the MUTCD has been adopted as state law in Kentucky and applies to all roads open to public travel. So that's the reason why. Now let's move into how do we determine these advisory speeds for curves. And as I dig into that, I'm going to give a shout out to Daryl. I noticed Daryl just joined us. So, hey, good morning, Daryl. Glad that you're with us. So let's look at how do we figure out what these advisory speeds are, which are critical for keeping people on the roadway, in their lane of travel, but also for using the other charts that you find in the MUTCD. They give us the advanced placement for a curve warning sign, the spacing for the chevrons on the outside of the curve, and table 2C-5, which shows us the level of curve signage we're required, recommended, or have an option to install. So this is on page 3 of your handout. It's also page 112 of the MUTCD, and it goes over acceptable methods, established methods for the determination of advisory speeds. And we have an accelerometer, we have the design speed equation. If I was designing a new roadway, of course, that's what I'd be using. We can also use that maybe with a single curve out there in the field where you and I would measure some of the different things on the curve itself, the chord length, and then we would also measure the super elevation, and we could calculate what that advisory speed would be. Or you could use what highway agencies for decades have used, and that's a traditional ball bank indicator. And the ball bank indicator is going to have some limits of degrees of ball bank as you're going around the curve. And those limits are going to be based upon how fast you're going around the curve. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to you or to me unless I know what a ball bank indicator looks like. So that's what we're going to show you next. And I'm going to illustrate it to begin with, the method with the traditional ball bank indicator. Now, I've got one of those here, and in the top left, you'll see a traditional ball bank indicator. This is a device, again, that agencies have used for decades. It works well. The criteria have changed a little bit over the years, but again, a great device. Once we cover that, we give you the basic method. Then I'm also going to share a little bit with you concerning the digital ball bank indicator, one produced by Riker Instruments, a upgrade to that is called the CARS system, Curve Advisory Reporting System. Makes it a little bit easier. And then we have something new that's out there. It's been out for a little while, but it's an app for your smartphone. And we'll talk about that as well. But to begin with the method, we'll just look at the traditional ball bank indicator. So as we read on page 112 of the MUTCD, page 3 of your handout, we could use this traditional ball bank indicator within these ranges or maximum limits for this ball. And this device essentially has a glass vial that's filled with oil, and there's a little ball floating in this oil. And if you and I were going to set a curve advisory speed, here's what we would do. Let's say that John and I are going to set a curve advisory speed. We're going to grab this device. We're going to go out to John's vehicle, to his car. We're going to mount this on the dash, and we're going to mount it so this little ball is exactly above the zero, the best we can. We'll do that in a level spot in the parking lot. We'll also make sure all 4 tires are aired up the way they should be. We don't have a low tire or anything like that. And then we're going to go out into the field to the road that we want to evaluate. Let's say that John's driving, I'll be riding, I'll be the passenger, the recorder. I got a clipboard and a pencil, and I'm writing down, taking notes on what I observe. And we're going to attempt to go first the speed limit. You know, if we can. If we think we can't make the curve, we can always slow down. But let's say the speed limit is 55 miles an hour. We got the curve coming up that we want to evaluate, and John takes it at 55 in a nice constant speed. He doesn't alter his speed. He goes 55 all the way through the curve. He also doesn't jerk the steering wheel. And he takes the path that most vehicles would take in the lane. Doesn't, again, jerk the steering wheel. And I'm going to watch this ball. And it's going to go up to the left or to the right, depending upon the direction we go around the curve. And how far it goes is a measure of the force on the vehicle. So let's say that we're going around this curve and it goes up to the number 5. We would call that 5 degrees of ball bank. And then we have gradations that continue. So this is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 28 degrees of ball bank. So let's say it goes up to 5. That feels like, man, maybe you're riding with your grandmother. You know, you're thinking that I'm going slow enough, somebody might run over me at any minute now. So you're looking in the rearview mirror. Let's say that we go around the curve and John's a daredevil. He takes it at 55, which is really way too fast for it. And this thing pegs out at 28. At that point, if I'm the passenger, I'm white knuckling the door handle. I'm also trying to stomp a hole in the floorboard because I'm thinking I got a brake over here that I don't have. And I'm thinking we're going to slide out of this curve at any minute. So that's what 28 feels like. Well, the MUTCD says there are acceptable levels of force on the vehicle based upon how fast you're going around the curve, not the speed limit. So if we go around that curve at 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, etc., then this little ball can go up to 12, but no higher. If we go around the curve at 25 and 30 miles an hour, then that little ball could go up to 14, but no higher. Higher than 14, it would be called an unsafe speed for the curve. And then as we go 20 miles per hour less, 20, 15, 10, 5, this little ball can go up to 16 degrees of ball bank, but no more. Otherwise, it's too much force on the vehicle and an unsafe speed. So let's say that John and I go around the curve at 55, and this little ball goes up to 14. Well, that's too much. The most allowed at 55 is 12 degrees. So I'm going to tell John, hey, man, that was too much. We're going to have to turn around and go back, ride that again. So we're going to ride it again 5 miles per hour less because our advisory speeds are set in 5 mile per hour increments. So we'll do that. We'll go around it at 50. Now, if the ball goes up to, let's say 13, again, that's too much. So we're gonna have to go again. Let's say I go around it at 45 and now the ball goes up to 11. Well, 11 is acceptable for 45 miles per hour. 35 or higher, 12 is the most allowed. So that's going to be where I would set the advisory speed. That's going to be the maximum safe speed for the curve. So determining or setting a curve advisory speed is nothing more than going around the curve multiple times in 5 mile per hour increments until you find the speed which is considered safe, the maximum speed which is considered safe with these ranges, 12, 14, and 16. We would also go each direction. So we would do each direction. And if that number came out to be exactly 12 or exactly 14, being good engineers, we'd probably run that 3 or 4 times just to make sure that none of those exceeded that particular number, 12 or 14. So let me check you on this. Let's see if you were following me on that. Let's say that we went out and we gathered this data. So we went around the curve at 40 miles an hour, John and I did. Little ball went up to 20, went around it at 35, it went to 16, 30, it went up to 13, 25, it went up to 10. If I were to bring you this set of data back in, what would you say is the maximum safe speed for the curve? Put that in the chat box. Hey, great job. The first one in was John, and we were riding together. So John, good job. 30 is correct. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I have, engineers that say, yeah, but maybe we want to be conservative. Maybe we want to put it at 25 or 20 or, 15. We pick a lower number. And that's not good because it creates a false sense of expectation with the public. In other words, your agency may be conservative 5, 10 miles an hour, but when they get to the next county or the next city and they're putting them where they should, which is the maximum safe speed for the curve, well, by then the people that live in your county or city, they might be used to going 10 miles an hour above whatever the advisory speed is shown. They get to the next county, well, now they're going way too fast. So that's where we want to put it, is at the maximum safe speed for the curve. And that's important for public safety. It's also important for liability. So let me check you again. Based upon these numbers, these are the actual numbers for this curve coming up. What do you think the maximum safe speed for the curve would be? And you have page 3 of your handout or page 112 of the MUTCD that has those numbers there. But what do you think it is? Where would you set the advisory speed? Yeah, great job. Kevin, Nick, you guys said 25 miles per hour in the chat box. And that's exactly right. That is the max safe speed. Now, 25 was right on the line. So Ken Agent gathered these numbers. He ran that multiple times to be sure. Part of the reason for that is that this was a Board of Claims case that the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet was involved in. Young lady lost control in this curve and ended up severely injured as a result. So 25, that's what was determined to be the maximum safe speed for the curve. And this is how it's currently signed. So what do you think Ken told him when he got back into the office after noting that? 35, and you see what happens at 35, it's greater than 25. He told the Transportation Cabinet, man, you're no longer arguing about winning or losing the case. Now it's just time to decide the amount. It's time to get the checkbook out. And so whenever we set an advisory speed, we want to be sure to set the maximum safe speed, but we don't want to go over it. We want to make sure that they're set appropriately. And again, that way either sometimes or oftentimes will help prevent injuries. It'll also help us in our lawsuits as well if they're set appropriately. This is another one where a young man lost his life. This is a fatality. This gentleman had a fight with his girlfriend. And then after the fight with his girlfriend, they said he got in his pickup truck and floored it and left and never let off the accelerator. You know, the next thing they heard was a large crash in one of these curves coming up, and this young man didn't make it. And as often happens in cases like this, there was a lawsuit that arose. And the plaintiff's experts said the advisory speed should have been 15, but according to the data, you know, signed at 25, do you think that it's signed appropriately? What do you think? Yes or no in the chat box. Do you think it's signed appropriately? Yeah, exactly. Kevin Stewart, you're exactly right. So it was. And this is a lawsuit that they should be able to easily defend themselves in. And that is a look at how we set curve advisory speeds. And then I'm going to go over the other three methods that we showed: the digital ball bank indicator, the car system, and the app for the smartphone. Before I do though, do you guys have any questions? Well, if not, let me run a couple of questions for you. This is a poll question that's going to pop up, and it's going to say, or it does say, what percentage of fatal crashes occur on curves in Kentucky? Over what percentage? This is something we looked at earlier. And if you remember, it was over 60% were roadway departure. But out of those fatal crashes, the 732 people we have killed, what percentage was on curves? So go ahead and jump in, get your vote counted. I'm going to share the results. Yeah, great job. That was just one little stat that I threw out at you, and the majority of you had that correct. It's B, 30%, over 30%. That's a great job. So let's ask you a question about the method. To set a curve advisory speed with a mechanical ball bank indicator, run the curve multiple times, opposite directions, in what increments? And by the way, this is the same set of increments that we set our speed limits in. A great job. 100% of you got that correct. 5 mile per hour increments. So if we see a curve advisory speed of 37 or a speed limit of 42, then you know someone's not following the MUTCD. So let's look at some other ways or some other alternative methods for setting those advisory speeds besides the mechanical ball bank indicator. And this is a great one. By the way, the mechanical ball bank indicator that we discussed, this device is about 180, 200 bucks, been around forever, long trusted, but you can also use a digital ball bank indicator. This is a fairly recent, 7-8 years ago, this came upon the scene, put out by Riker, and it works much the same way. It, rather than having the analog ball that you read, actually has a digital readout, and it does have some advantages. Well, let's say John and I were going to use this, and we went ahead and purchased one. They're somewhere between $700 to $900. Well, let's say that we bought one. All right, we mounted that on our dash. We were on a level section of pavement in the parking lot, mounted it on the dash to where that this thing is reading 0, perhaps. We don't have to quite do that though. This device is neat in that it has a REL button on the left-hand side, and that stands for relative 0. So if you get it close, you can hit the relative 0 button and it will auto level. But we would mount it on the dash, we would calibrate it, and then we would drive the road that we wanted to study. And the cool thing about it is in the calibration, we can actually set an alarm angle. Right, so we can set an alarm angle, and this device will then buzz when it hits 12, 14, or 16 degrees. And that's pretty cool. That means that if I have a county road that is 10 miles in length, I could do an initial run. In other words, John and I could get in the vehicle, and if the speed limit is 55, we could run that road at 55 miles an hour. I could set the alarm angle at 12 degrees because that's the most allowed at 55. And then every time we got to a change in the roadway, which exceeded that 12 degrees, this thing's going to buzz. It's going to go off with the alarm, and I'm going to know that, hey, we need to evaluate this curve further. And that way we can identify how many curves we have to look at. The reason I say that is because you can have a curve which is slight enough of a curve or not quite as sharp, that has really good super elevation, that doesn't require curve signage. So not all changes in the roadway to the left or to the right require curve signage. And so if you can take it and the ball doesn't go up to, or doesn't go above 12 at 55 miles an hour, then that doesn't necessarily need curve signage. You're not required or recommended to at that point. So that alarm angle is really handy for that initial run. Something else that's cool about it is it has a min-max button. It's desirable to do this with two people, but let's say that John is by himself today. I called in sick or something like that. Maybe I'm swimming about the head, jerking at the navel or something like that. So if that's the case, then he can go out by himself and he can reset this device before he gets to the curve. And then when he gets to the curve, this is going to record the most negative and the most positive number. The negative number shows the curve or turn to the left. The positive number shows the curve or turn to the right. So after he gets through the curve, he can pull that back up. So that way he can gather that data. You can also do a reverse curve since it's recording both directions. In addition, it has a serial port, so you could connect this to a computer and gather the data that way. Now, to help you, if you're using a digital ball bank indicator, page 4 of your handout, we have instructions on setting curve advisory speeds and using that digital ball bank indicator. Now, really, it's a simple process. It's just going around the curve multiple times in 5-mile-per-hour increments, comparing your reading to that 12, 14, and 16 numbers that I gave you from the MUTCD. But they asked 2 engineers to come up with the method, and that's why it's a whole page written down for you. And again, that's on page 4 of your handout. Now, this is considered an engineering study, and per the MUTCD, it should be done either by an engineer or under the direction of an engineer. And something else about engineering studies is they need to be written down. So we also provide you on page 5 and 6 a couple of forms that you can use to write down your results. And on page 5, you have an initial run form. That's for if we were going the entire roadway, the 10 miles, John and I, then we could identify the locations that need evaluation for curve signage. And then we could use the second form as we come back and evaluate each one of these locations. In addition to that, we give you an example of these filled out. All right, so on page 7 of your handout, you have the initial run data. This is a road that we looked at in Boone County, so northern Kentucky. Following that, you have the example speed study on page 7, 8 in your handout. It's already filled out for you, and you can see that. I'll show you one example here. We started at the intersection with US 68, hit the vehicle tripometer. They didn't have a DMI, distance measuring instrument, so we used that. When we got to 0.6, the alarm angle went off. We had set it at 14, because we were going to run 30 miles an hour, and that's the max allowed at 30. And so I recorded the reading. It went up to 15. That means we need to come back and evaluate it. And we did. You can see that number transferred there, the south direction. And we found at 25 miles an hour, it was 14 or less. So that was the acceptable advisory speed for that particular curve or change in the roadway, and for each direction. So that's the digital ball bank indicator. And if you would like to borrow one of those and you're listening as a local agency, a city or a county, let us know. We have those for loan in our equipment library, and they're free of charge. So we had the mechanical one, a couple of $100. We had the digital ball bank indicator put up by Riker, $700 to $900. Depends on who you are and how many you're buying. Next, we have the CARS method. This is a curve advisory reporting system. Essentially, they took the Riker unit, they paired it up with a GPS unit, and then proprietary software. And this is pretty neat because with this one, you can drive through the roadway each direction just one time, and it gathers all the data almost that you need to set curve advisory speeds. So rather than having to run each curve multiple times, you can just go through once. The cost of this, though, we've had a little difficulty in finding that. Again, it depends on how many you're buying, what have you. They loaned it to the university for 6 months so we could study and evaluate it. So we didn't pay for it. But for example, the Georgia DOT, they purchased 10 of these units, and I was told they paid about $4,000 a unit and a yearly or annual subscription fee for the proprietary software. And by the way, if you want to borrow just the digital one from us, Janet put the link in the chat box to that so that you could find that easily. Let's talk about the CARS method. This is one of the locations that we looked at. Actually, Ken Agent looked at this one, and this was a really curvy section. Man, it would have been a lot of time to set these with a traditional ball bank indicator. So they ran this. Each one of these dots is sort of the cookie crumb trail that was being set by the GPS unit. And I said that it gathers almost all the data you need, but not quite. What happens is you have to come back in and pick, once you come back to the office, you have to pick the beginning of the curve and the end of the curve, the POC and the PT. Once you do that, though, it spits out the advisory speed. So it is a lot less work, but it's also more expensive. And to show you how that compares, they compared it to the existing signage, the digital ball bank indicator, and then the CARS system, because the transportation cabinet wanted us to evaluate it, speaking of University of Kentucky, to evaluate it to make sure that it was going to be an acceptable method, because it was fairly new technology. It wasn't an established method, as you see in the MUTCD in the old mechanical ball bank indicator. So the digital and the CARS system both were tested, and it lined up the majority of the time and was determined to be an acceptable method. It's just another location near Lexington. And there we had actual data where we had calculated it based upon the design speed equation. And we had used some method proprietary software that's actually free from the Texas Transportation Institute called the Tram Software. This is also taking the Riker unit and pairing it up with a digital ball bank indicator, but it doesn't have all that nice software. And with this one, you had to stop at the beginning of the curve, start it, go through the curve, stop the program. And that's a lot more trouble, a lot more time, and also really on some of our roads, a lot more dangerous. So we sort of ruled out that one as a method, but we compared the digital ball bank indicator with the CARS system with that traditional mechanical one. And we also compared it with the existing signage. The existing signage was okay, over 80% of the time. But really, where we decided that it was a good device to use is we compared the traditional ball bank indicator with the CARS system. And about half the time it lined up exactly, but the majority of the time, 96% of the time, it was within 5 miles per hour. And so it was determined that this also was a acceptable method. And so based upon that engineering study done by the university for KYTC, the digital ball bank indicator and the CARS system both were found to be acceptable methods or ways of setting curve advisory speeds in addition to the mechanical one or the design speed equation that we discussed earlier. So that being said, the last one is this particular method. Now this one, anecdotally, which just means from experience, it seems like it works well. So this is an app for your smartphone that you can get. You know, it's called the Ball Bank app. It only is available for iOS. Christopher Dry, the guy that created it, hasn't made it available on the Android platform, and really, I don't think he's done a lot with it in the past few years. But if you wanted to download it, there's the link to do so. And it's pretty cool. Again, anecdotally, just in our experience, it lines up well with the mechanical ball bank indicator and the digital one. It's also free of charge. At the moment, there's no charge for this particular app. And you can use your smartphone. There's some settings where you can alter how it's reading that, so you can make it line up even better. But if you were going to use this method, you would download the app to your smartphone. Again, John and I would mount our phone in the vehicle, on the dash, the bubble right above 0, and then we would go out into the field. Now, the cool thing about it is it will also allow you to record the screen. So as far as data collection, that works out really well because you have a proven record of what you got out there in the field. So let me show you an example of that. This is one of the curves that Ken and I looked at, and you're going to see a picture of the ball bank indicator. It gives us what the current reading is, our current speed, and then it also shows us a GPS location, a map of where we're at. So I'm going to play that for you. And even then, sometimes it's hard to tell exactly how far it went. So I put it in slow motion for you. When it gets to the point where it hits the maximum, it'll be in slow motion. Now, Ken was trying to go 35 miles an hour around this curve, but it was also downhill. And that gets really tough when you have a horizontal curve and a vertical curve combined. And so he did shoot up to 38 on the speed, but we were still at 26 degrees of ball bank reading, which means, man, 35 was way too fast for that curve. So we had enough data to determine that and know that we needed to run it again at 30 miles an hour. So any questions about any of those 4 methods? The mechanical ball bank indicator, the digital, the car system, or the app for the smartphone? Well, while you're thinking of questions, let me go ahead and run you a couple more poll questions, just to test your knowledge on it. The maximum allowable degree of ball bank reading for a speed of 25 and 30 is what? What do you think? So for 25 and 30, and you can find that again in your handout or the MUTCD. In your handout, that was on page 3. It's also page 112 of the MUTCD. Give you just a couple more seconds to get your vote in, get it counted. And great job. 86% of you got that right. Yeah, it's 14 degrees. So if I were using the digital ball bank indicator, what alarm angle would I set for an initial run speed of 55 miles per hour? And this is the alarm angle we would set so that if it exceeded that, the alarm would go off, and we know that, man, we got to come back and evaluate this curve. And again, we'll locate that with GPS or mile point or some way to identify it so we can come back to it. A great job. 90% of you got that correct. 12 degrees, a ball bank is where we would set that. And I see a question in the chat box. I'm going to answer that once we get done with this poll question. And if you have any others, again, put those in the chat box. Let your fingers do the walking. So options to improve safety on a curve using the progressive approach would include what? Now, this is something we didn't cover, but I'm testing your overall knowledge of the MUTCD. So let's say that I had the basic package up. I've got a turn sign, 25-mile-per-hour advisory speed, one direction large arrow on the outside of the curve, and I know that's not working. And I know it's not working because either I got the crash history, I have my maintenance records which show I've had to replace that one direction large arrow 5 times in the past 2 years because people ran over it, or I see a lot of skid marks on the road, or maybe maintenance was out there picking up litter and they found a large collection of auto parts on the outside of the curve. We've done that before. We'll find bumper covers and headlight lenses, all these things, and that tells us, man, we got a problem here. So what would you do next? And great job. You got all that correct, all the above. Interesting side note that adding a curve or turn sign to the left-hand side of the road, there are some states where they rarely ever do that. I've been out west before and I've mentioned that that's a possibility. And I've had some cities and counties say, is that even allowed? And I'm like, oh yeah, I got all kinds of photos where I can show you where it's being done. And the next question is, yeah, but were you guys doing it correctly? Yeah, absolutely. So you got to find the spot in the MUTCD to show them. So let's answer one of the questions that I have in the chat box. Tom asked, does the smartphone also have to be mounted on the dashboard? And Tom, I can tell you that I haven't put it on the dashboard always. I've had one of those holders that goes into the cup holder for your phone. And as long as I had it level, there in the center console, it worked fine. But again, I'll caution you about using the smartphone. It's handy, it's free, but so far we haven't had a study that shows us that it's a established method, I guess. In other words, KYTC has hired UK to come in and do a research project, and we know that the digital ball bank indicator and the car system are acceptable as an engineering practice. And although I can tell you that from personal experience, that app on the smartphone lines up really well, that still doesn't make it a established engineering procedure. You really need an engineering study on it to say for sure. And that's why I encourage you to, if you're with a city or a county, man, just come to us and you can borrow a device. We'll even show you how to use it, come out with you, help you set a curve advisory speed, do some technical assistance. So with this webinar, the goal of it was really just to try to show you how to keep people on the road and give you some information about setting curve advisory speeds and some of the different methodologies that are out there. If you like what you heard and you're thinking, man, I'd like to know more about it, I'd like to know more about those rules of curve signage, let us know. There's a workshop that we have developed. It's a full-day workshop that we occasionally offer where we spend the morning going over exactly what we talked about today, but in addition, everything about curve signage. And then in the afternoon, we'll gather up a bunch of digital ball bank indicators and mechanical ones, and we'll break you up into teams and send you out into the field and let you practice this method as well.